Hello friends, Heidi here from Rain Country. God is good all the time. And today I wanted to talk mostly about the differences between making wine and making vinegar. They do start out very much the same, but there is a difference in the overall process. And I do want to talk about a few other differences, such as the difference between a fermentation starter and a natural soda. So the number one difference between making wine and then making vinegar is that you can see here, I have these two vinegars. This one is almost done. I'm just letting it finish out. It probably needs about another week to finish getting tart enough for me to strain out and then put away in storage. And then this one I think has about 2 more weeks to go. So as you can see, these ones have fabric covers, and that is all that they have on them. There's no tight fitting lid. Making wine and making vinegar start out the same in the fact they both need sugars to feed off of in order to become their finished product. However, when you're making vinegar, you need to have oxygen exposure so that the sugar then converts to alcohol, then into acetic acid. And that's what gives you the vinegar. You cannot have it be vinegar without some kind of oxygen exposure to the process as it's being made. Now, wine or mead is the opposite. They'll start out the same as the vinegar. However, it needs to be deprived of oxygen in order for it to become a good wine. Otherwise, it will turn to vinegar. But you also need to have a way that, because in any case, in any kind of fermentation, you're going to have gases that are going to build up, and those gases have to be released in some form. Obviously, when you're making the vinegar, the cloth cover, the gases are escaping just as well as the oxygen is able to get in. The cloth cover is only there to prevent fruit flies and dust and things like that from getting into the vinegar. So it can be made without the cloth, but you wouldn't really want to do that. But in the case of these two meads I have going back here, this one's vanilla and this one's strawberry. I know it looks brown, but that's just because of the honey I'm using. Is, like I've said in some of my previous videos, is an old dark honey I'm trying to use up, so I'm making a bunch of different meads and trying to color them like the blueberries. Same thing here. Trying to use fruits and things that can color it to help hide the darkness. It does get lighter over time. Like here's mead I made with a dark honey, and the color wasn't quite so bad when it was done, but so at least the brown in there does lighten up over time, but it's still not as beautiful as one that is made with a golden honey, a much lighter looking honey, but it still tastes just as good no matter what color it is. Anyways, you can see here these two meads. This one's been going for at least a week or so longer than this one, and that's why this one you see a lot more bubbles in here, because this one's pretty new. I only started it a few days ago. The bubbles you see going through are the gases escaping as the yeast are converting the sugars into alcohol. That makes those gases. The gases that are being created through the process of the bacteria and yeast turning the sugars into alcohol. That's why also when you're making vinegar, you'll see right in the first week of the process especially, you'll see it get very bubbly. It's the same process happening there. The only difference is you're not only allowing the gases to escape, you're allowing the oxygen in, but that process is the same. So at about the 1 week to 2 week mark is where things really change. In the process of making vinegar, it goes from being alcohol into making a vinegar, whereas with your wine and mead making, it stays alcohol, but it will get stronger and become more alcoholic as it works through those sugars. So if it's allowed to finish its full process and works through all the sugar that's put in there, that is when it's completely done and it's going to have its strongest alcohol content. Obviously, the more sugar added to either of these is going to make a stronger finished result. But the same applies to both, is you cannot, if you put too much sugar in at the beginning, it can prevent or slow a good ferment from getting going. So if you're wanting a stronger alcohol content or a stronger vinegar, a higher acidity, you may consider adding more sugar about a week into the process. I don't recommend going past 2 weeks into the process, because by that point it's already starting to do that change. And once it does that, adding sugar past the 2-week mark, I personally would say not even past the 1-week mark, because I found adding sugar at the 2-week mark can cause the whole fermentation to come to a complete stop. And it also depends on how much sugar you put in. So even though it feeds on the sugar, you can actually kill it if you overfeed it. Just like anything else will die if you overfeed it. So it's got to have a right balance. And the same thing goes with the wine. A lot of times when you're making wine, I never do this when I'm making mead, but I'll do this a lot of times with wine, and I'll explain why on that in a minute as well. Sometimes adding some kind of sugar, if it's mead, it's going to be more honey, in at the 1-week mark after it's real bubbly and it's really starting to work through those sugars. That can be a good point to add more sugar in. But again, same thing as with the vinegar, you don't want to add it in too late or it will stop it entirely. So let me talk for a minute about the differences between mead and wine. So mead is simply just water and honey. What I have here are flavored meads. Now I have a video just on making fruit flavored meads, so it would explain how to do what I did here. And I like to use either fresh or freeze-dried fruits when I'm doing this. So I will link to my video down below on mead making, and I talk about some of the many different meads so that you can get some ideas from that. I've made so many different flavors. I know there's some I never even got pictures of. So anyway, yeah, the mead is 3 cups of honey for every 1 gallon of mead you're going to make. So you have 3 cups of honey, 1 cup of your fermentation starter. If you're going to do like I do when I'm making it, I use my homemade fermentation starter, and then the rest is with a good filtered water with no chlorine in it, and then that's what you make mead with. Now you can choose to do like I do and add some things for flavoring. Again, go check out that video. But really, mead can simply be honey and water, and really honey and water can ferment just fine without the fermentation starter. So you can get a good ferment going with raw honey. Yes, raw honey, it will ferment beautifully, and water without using a fermentation starter. I just prefer to add that just to make sure it gets going. Okay, so let me finish explaining the difference between mead and wine. So mead is honey water, and then wine is made with pure juice. So that can be any kind of juice or any blend of juice. I've made wine from just pure apple juice that I pressed from our own apples. As you can see right here, I've made wine from a blend of our own grape juice from our own grapes and some wild picked blackberries, and that one turned out really good, but it was still pure juice. And then from there, when you're making wine, you still need to add sugar to it. And I recommend, I think in my original winemaking video, I might have added 3 cups of the sugar at the start. I recommend not doing that, even though mine turned out beautiful. It's better to start out when you're working with a pure juice like that, because there's already going to be a lot of sugar in the juice, and especially it depends on how sweet the juice is. I recommend not putting more than 2 cups of sugar per gallon of juice when you're doing that, because again, you can slow or stop. Then what I do is about a week in, I add another cup of sugar. So even though you're using all that juice, and that juice can become wine, to get a better wine, it's still best to add sugar to it. That's going to make it stronger and just better all the way around. And keep in mind, if you're diabetic or you're worried about sugar intake, when you're making vinegar, when you're making wine, remember the sugar is being converted into something entirely different. And so it's not like unless you do like I've been doing with like this one here. I stopped the fermentation process on this about a week early, so it wouldn't be so strong of a wine, this blueberry mead, and more like a very lightly fermented blueberry honey soda. And it is delicious. It is so good. As long as I just have a small glass of this, I can get away with just enjoying the flavor and the bubbliness of it without having the effects that alcohol can cause. And that's what I try to avoid. So again, wine is made with pure juice and sugar. Mead is made with water and honey. And those are the two main differences. Other than that, the process is the same. You still need to airlock, you still need to ferment it for about 30 days. Same thing with your vinegar, you ferment it for 30 days. Now, for just a basic natural soda, you can do the same process as with your wine. And I have several videos on making sodas, whether it be like fermented fruit smoothies or taking a fruit juice and turning it into a natural soda. And this can even be store-bought fruit juice. Coming to the fermentation starter, anyone can make this out of anything. You can use herbs or fruits. You can even use vegetables. It's most commonly known as a ginger bug because a lot of times it's made with ginger, water, and sugar and nothing else. In fact, when I first started getting into mead making quite a number of years ago, that's what I did, was I made the ginger bug. And then as I learned how it worked, I thought, well, why would I have to have ginger? Because I can't seem to grow it very good here and it's really expensive at the store. And I started experimenting with some different fruits and found I could make a starter out of anything. And I even have a starter in the refrigerator that I started back in the early spring using red clover and dandelions, and it's still alive, it's still good. This one's actually been going quite a while too, and it has different fruits in it because I keep changing it as I go. And that's the thing, whatever you start off with, you don't have to keep it that way. You can periodically strain it out and add all new fresh fruit. So when you're talking about your fermentation starter, the whole process of this, it starts the same way as your vinegar and anything else. I've got a video, a pretty in-depth one just on the starter that I'll link down below. So I'm not going to talk in depth about it, but the main difference here is you're stopping the fermentation process at about the 3-day mark, or whenever it gets to the point where it's very, very fizzy. And then what you want to do is you want to store it in your fridge. You can keep it out, like years ago when I had mine going, I used to keep it out on top of the refrigerator, but then I had to feed it every day. And if you're keeping it in a warm place, it needs to be fed every day because it's going to work through the sugars faster. If you keep it in the refrigerator, it doesn't stop the process. It just slows it way down. It pretty much puts it into hibernation, but it's still going to work through those sugars. So if it sits too long, eventually it can turn to wine. And it's usually not a very good tasting wine either because of how it's made. It's not made with juice. It's just made with sugar, water, and some fruit. And the whole purpose of the fruit or the herbs is to add the bacteria and the natural yeast that you can find on just about everything, so that gets that whole process going. That's what that's for. And once you have good lively bacteria and yeast in there, it's just going to keep feeding through that sugar. And but still, I do like to keep adding some kind of fruit or herbs or something every so often, not all the time. But if I don't use my starter for a long period of time, I try to remember to pull it out. You don't want it to go, it can usually last in the fridge without needing to be fed for up to a month. But I find it tends to stay healthier if it gets fed just a little bit of sugar, like maybe to a quart jar like this, maybe a teaspoon of sugar once a week. And usually what I do whenever I use it, I never use it in making vinegar, but you can. But whenever I use it for making a natural soda or kimchi or anything like that, obviously some of the liquid's going to be gone, and then I add a little bit of sugar at that point, so I'm going to feed it and then add some more water and then allow it to get bubbly. That's the difference there between that and a vinegar and a wine. And then a natural soda, this is what I use to make any of that stuff, is going to be, usually for me, it's going to be either a smoothie, which is mostly blended up fruit in water or juice, or just straight juice that I add the fermentation starter and let it sit for up to 3 days on the counter to get good and bubbly. Now that at that point is going to be safe for most anyone, even children. But you got to watch it because your household temperature can cause it to ferment quicker. And so maybe in 2 days it's ready. So when it comes to a natural soda and you're wanting to keep it as alcohol free as possible, you want to stop the process as soon as it gets that bubbliness that you want it, then stick it in your refrigerator, and then I recommend working through it quickly. Because again, in the fridge, it'll keep fermenting. So if you're trying to avoid that alcohol to get all together, it needs to be used up right away. But if you would like it a little bit stronger, you know, somewhere in that in-between point, just let it sit for a few more days. And again, it's going to be entirely up to you and who you're giving that to. And natural sodas can be very, very healthy because they're going to have that good gut-friendly bacteria, and plus with that working through the sugars, it's going to be a lower sugar. Even if you're not adding any sugar to it, you're just using juice, all natural juice has had no sugar to it, but you're trying to cut back on your carbs. By fermenting it for a couple days, that's going to lower the amount of carbs in that juice, whatever juice it is. So anyway, those are kind of the main differences there. I'm not sure if I covered all the questions, but I have videos on how to do all these things. The purpose of this was to kind of talk about some of these differences, because a lot of people get confused. Well, they try to make vinegar, but they put an airlock on it. Can't do that. You're going to end up with wine. Or they try to make wine, but they do it this way, and if you do that, you're going to end up with vinegar after a certain amount of time. It's okay to start off with a cover on your wine, as long as if after about 3 days you then put an airlock on it. You don't want it to sit longer than 3 days without an airlock on it when you're making wine. But for the first few days, that's fine. In fact, a lot of times that is the way wine or mead is made. That is how they naturally and the reason for that is to collect the yeast that's all around us and have that do the work, rather than adding a starter like this. For me, I like to have a little bit more control. I make my own starter, I put it in there, and then let it do its thing that way. Oh, and one more thing I wanted to say, basically the main differences between kombucha and vinegar. And I'm not a kombucha person. I've done it off and on for years, and I finally realized I just don't like tea. I mean, I love herbal teas, which are technically known as infusion, but when you're talking true tea, it all comes from the same plant, the Camellia sinensis, and I don't like any of them. and it's all just depends on what time of the growing period it's processed and how it's processed. That's how you get white, green, oolong, or black. It all comes from the same plant, and I don't like any of them. I never have. I tried to, but I think that's just why kombucha isn't my thing. I don't like tea. But basically, the main difference between kombucha and vinegar is that kombucha is made with black tea, vinegar is made with everything else. And then if you're stopping your kombucha process early, where you end, unlike what we used to do back in the days when we called it mushroom tea, and you're stopping it while it's still sweet and bubbly, then basically you're making just a natural soda like I do with everything else. So when I take my home pressed apple cider and turn that into a sparkling apple cider, it's the same idea. I'm just using that juice instead of a black tea. It's basically the same idea. Oh, and I don't use a SCOBY when I'm making natural soda, because I use my fermentation starter for that instead. Oh yes, and the other thing I wanted to say is, anything that you want to keep that bubbliness to and not have it turn to vinegar, that's why you put a tight fitting lid on it. That's why with my starter, you might need to burp it now and then when it's sitting out on the counter. So that's why with my natural sodas, my starters, I never just put a cloth on them. I always keep a tight fitting lid, and since it's only for a few days, I just check it and burp it occasionally like that. But yes, you can use airlocks on these kind of things as well. Same thing with your kimchis, your other fermented vegetables. I just don't prefer to do that. I just save that for my wine. All right, well, I hope I answered all the questions and got you headed in the right direction on some of the differences here. Don't forget to check out the various different how-to videos I'll be putting down below. How to make mead, how to make a fermentation starter, how to make a fermented fruit smoothie, how to make vinegar. I'll put a bunch of those in the description box down below. So remember, you got to click on either show more, which will be if you're on a PC or a computer, which will be right down here below my channel name, or if you're on a smart device of any kind, I believe you should be able to see a little tiny gray triangle down here. If you click on one of those, depending on the device you're on, that will open up the description box so you can see the links. And if I forget to add a link that I say I'm going to put in there, remind me, because it happens, and I'll make sure I get that down there. All right, well, thanks for watching. Take care, and God bless.